Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, on November 24th, 1963, an unassuming man leapt in front of news reporters and police officers as Lee Harvey Oswald was being escorted through the basement of a Dallas police station. The man fatally shot Oswald once in the abdomen, and it was captured on live TV. The shooter was Jack Ruby, who would forever be known as the guy who shot JFK. But who exactly was Jack Ruby?
We're thrilled to chat with Danny Fingeroth, a biographer, cultural historian, and former writer and editor at Marvel Comics, whose latest book is Jack Ruby, The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin. He also authored A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee, Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero, and Superman on the Couch, What Superheroes Really Tell Us About Ourselves and Our Society. Danny, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And as I said in the pre-show conversation, it's a lot of pressure to be on a show called Amusing Jews, but I will do my best.
You spent over 10 years uncovering the life and times of Jack Ruby. What initially attracted you to him as a research topic?
You know, of course, my background is comics and graphic novels. I've written a number of books and a ton of comic books. And around, as it was coming to be the 50th anniversary of the assassination, of the JFK assassination, I really thought, gee, I had not done a full-length nonfiction graphic novel before. And I'd like to, and I'd like to do something that people might actually want to buy and read. I wonder if there's a lot of people doing JFK 50th anniversary graphic novels, and I couldn't find anybody doing one. It turned out that somebody else was, that the Dan Mishkin and I'm blanking on the artist, but they did one about the Warren Commission. But that was I didn't know about that. Then it's a whole different approach. So I started researching the Kennedy assassination. I was 10 years old when it happened. Your listeners and viewers can do the math and figure out how old I am. But I was 10 years old when it happened, and so I had a 10-year-old's understanding of it. And I was never obsessed with the various conspiracy theories. It just seemed like a blur to me. It just seemed like you could plug in 100 different theories, and it was overwhelming, So it's not that I didn't believe that maybe there was more going on than the general understanding, but it just was an overload. So I started researching, and the more I read about Jack Ruby, the more I realized that was my entry point into the story of the JFK assassination. He was a greatest generation Jewish guy, first generation American born from like a crazy enmeshed Jewish family, one sibling nuttier than the next, all of them interesting. And here was, what I say to people is, unless you yourself are your craziest cousin, imagine your craziest cousin stepping into history and killing Oswald. Either way, whether you identify with it or somebody, because that's, and so that was approaching the 50th anniversary. And I did a lot of research, and then I realized there was a memoir written by a Los Angeles rabbi named Hillel Silverman, whose son you may know from the movie Weekend at Bernie's, Jonathan Silverman. Well, Jonathan Silverman's father, Hillel, who just died like 2 years ago at age 99, was sort of on his career path. He was a rabbi in Dallas for 10 years, and one of his congregants was Jack Ruby. And Silverman wrote about it in his memoir, and he was interviewed a lot. And, I was able to make contact with him through some contacts of mine in the Jewish world, and I spoke to him, and he said even 10, 12 years ago, he said, I'm almost 90. I'm not writing my book anymore. Everybody in that Jack Ruby courtroom was writing a book. I'm not writing my book anymore. Would you like to see my notes on when I visited Jack in prison every other day for 4 months? I said, "Yeah, I wouldn't mind." So you know, the notes came and they were just mind-boggling. I didn't realize how rich they were until I compared them to like the trial transcripts and the newspaper reports and and I went, the stuff of the rabbi visiting him and the rabbi's own reflections really were just sort of an added ingredient that it made it, for better or worse, a very Jewish story. Ruby was very Jewish identified. He was very concerned about anti-Semitism in Dallas. Anyway, I did a lot of research, and then I was connected by a book packager named Howard Zimmerman, who I knew from working at a company called Byron Price. And he put me together with an artist who you may have heard of named Rick Geary. Rick is a great, I guess, I don't know if you call him underground or independent. He's still, I mean, he still puts out lots of graphic novels, a lot about true murder cases. And really, we couldn't find anybody who would pay us an advance big enough for Rick to spend 2 years drawing this 200-page graphic novel. So I backburnered it. And then in the meantime, I wrote some of the other books, including specifically the Stan Lee biography. So I had some credentials as a biographer. That book was generally well reviewed and sold pretty well. So as we're coming around the 60th anniversary, I said to my agent, "Do you think we could revive the Ruby graphic novel project just as a straight prose biography?" And we did, and I wrote an elaborate proposal, and Chicago Review Press bought it. And in the meantime, I wouldn't say I spent every waking moment researching it, but obviously my antenna were up, and I would just anytime I saw anything or heard anything about Ruby. Um, and then, as much as I love graphic novels and comics, certainly my approach for a prose, biography, I had to do a lot more research, and I knew a lot more about biographies and how they're done, and so I figured I'm not smart enough to figure out all the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination. Smarter people than me have spent decades trying to figure out what really happened. But I know crazy Jews, and so I could try to figure out something about what might have motivated Jack Ruby. And so I did a bunch of research at the sixth floor museum, which is the book depository in Dallas. I spoke to Ruby's niece and nephew, who before that had not really done a lot of speaking to the press or biographers. I spoke to, of course, the rabbi. I spoke to the children of the other Jewish strip club owners in Dallas at the time who hated Jack Ruby but had to do business. I found out a lot more about like the seamy underbelly of the Dallas nightclub subculture and criminal subculture than I wanted to. But so that was my interest. But it's similar to my interest in writing about the history of uh, the Jews who were the creators and publishers of Superman, Batman, the Fantastic, Marvel and DC and Will Eisner and graphic novels. So it was sort of a fascination with that generation. That was my parents and aunts and uncles' generation. And yet, obviously, the comic book people and obviously people like Jack Ruby went different routes, and yet not so different. There were people. My father had multiple careers, but one of them was he was a partner in a kosher banquet catering business in the Bronx. And so in that business, I don't know, he died fairly young when I was fairly young, but I have a feeling he came across a lot of shady characters in that world that that there's a lot going on behind the scenes at your fancy bar mitzvah that you don't want to know about. And I have a feeling that my dad probably came in contact with and associated with people not unlike Jack Ruby, except Ruby had a Chicago accent and my family had a New York accent.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
You mentioned in the book that you were buying comics at a secondhand magazine store on First Avenue in Manhattan when JFK was assassinated. How did you first learn that Oswald had been shot?
I really need to make up a good answer for this question because I don't have one. I It's so stupid. I remember where I was when I found out that JFK was shot because and you know, I was a student at a yeshiva in New York, and it was November, and it got dark early on Friday, and so we were dismissed early on Friday. But the friend I was with and I both lived close enough. We went to school close enough to where we lived that we could kill some time, and so we were both comic fans, and we went to this used comic shop on like around 86 in Yorkville in Manhattan. And I just remember we were walking and we saw some other friends from school and they told us, and that's about as dull as it can get. And then I just have a memory of seeing Ruby, and I honestly don't know if I saw it live or if I saw a videotape of it. Because here's the thing: in the days before the internet, in the days before videotape, there was just TV. And if you're 10 years old, all that was on every channel was the Kennedy assassination coverage. And, the way news, this is really the first, widespread covered event. And really, it was just repeating the same stuff over and over and over. And meanwhile, I'm 10 years old. Where are my cartoons?
It began with the fatal shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin of John Kennedy, by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner, in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Here's how it looked and sounded on live nationwide television. The voice is that of NBC reporter Tom Pettit.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
I know I saw it, but I don't have a great memory of it. I really have to just make something up and just, because everybody else has, oh, my mother's face turned white and, my father keeled over. I mean, everybody has a story. And I'm like, you know, I'm sure we were watching TV because it was obviously a major thing. My dad, because he had this catering business, he worked on the weekend. So, I'm sure my dad was trying to figure out whether to even go ahead with the weddings and bar mitzvahs they had planned that weekend. Because my dad was a quote unquote famous cantor. In other words, like being a famous comic book editor. It's important to who it's important to. I think my dad was probably getting ready, to go and officiate at a wedding ceremony and wondering what the mood would be. But I do remember watching, seeing it on TV. But and again, you're 10 years old. When you're a kid, you kind of think, well, maybe this happens all the time, and I just didn't know about it because I'm 10 years old. Or maybe I was just an idiot. But the magnitude of it, I knew it, but I don't have a great story. So all I can do is just try to be amusing and dance around and explain that I don't have a great story.
In your defense, Danny, one day somebody will ask me for an OJ story. I was pretty young when it happened. I don't really remember, but it was interrupting a lot of my cartoons as well. I do remember that.
Yeah, it's the whole kid view of the world.
Yeah. And then he was on my pogs, and I was like, oh, okay, well, this is another cultural outgrowth.
It's interesting that it turns out the Jack Ruby story and Jack Ruby's life intersected with a bunch of my, culture and sport heroes. I mean, most specifically Mickey Mantle, who was, this blonde hair, blue eyed, shining baseball god to every Jewish boy uh, who wasn't a Dodgers fan, in New York. So that Mickey, I mean, that when you asked me before what led me to want to, do the Ruby story. It was the Jewish thing, but then it was also that this guy, because he was in show business, albeit like, a sleazy aspect of show business, came into contact with all these unexpected people. Jack Ruby, the last person to give Hank Williams Sr. regular work. And suddenly Mickey Mantle is showing up and Louis Armstrong. I mean, just this lineup of people that go, and Rabbi Silverman, and then all the celebrities. My joke used to be, and maybe you guys in LA can double or triple check. I used to joke that Silverman got burned out in Dallas and went to LA and became Buddy Hackett's rabbi. But, it turned out he was Buddy Hackett's rabbi. You know? So there was so many weird intersections of, and then it turned out that Jack Kirby who, co-created all the major Marvel characters, drew a Jack Ruby comic for Esquire magazine in 1967. So all this stuff it seemed I was fated to write a book about Jack Ruby.
You spent most of your career as a Marvel Comics writer and editor. Did any of that experience come in handy when piecing together the convoluted story of Jack Ruby?
One thing we deal in a lot in superhero comics is conspiracy stories. Doctor Doom was behind this and the Red Skull and it go, sort of layer upon layer. So that view of the world was not unfamiliar to me. And I think the thing that I tried to do, you know, I've read biographies of really interesting people, and the biographies were so boring. It's like, and you go, how did you take this really interesting person and make such a dull book? And so I guess one thing that I learned in the world of genre comics, of superhero comics, was if not every page, certainly every chapter has to end on some kind of cliffhanger, and ideally, several of them. So I tried to do that. I tried to, without sensationalizing it, I tried, and I mean, you have a story with, people getting shot and suspicions of conspiracies and anti-Semitism and racism and just American history and you just have all the ingredients for a great story. Whatever else you may think. I mean, there's there that is one of the reasons that people are still talking about it. They're still having congressional hearings 60 plus years later. So I mean, there's it's a compelling story, and I just tried not to mess it up.
During the trial, Ruby's defense tried to argue that he had a temporary blackout at the time he shot Oswald. Do you think there's any validity to that?
I think there was, yes. The short answer is yes. But like everything else with the Kennedy assassination, it's complicated and there are layers upon layers. So Ruby's nutty family, they band together because they just saw their brother kill Lee Harvey Oswald on television. And so they pooled their resources, and most of the resources were in the hands of his kid brother, Earl Ruby, who was a dry cleaning magnate in Detroit. And Earl really looked up to Jack. Jack had Jack was a violent, short-tempered guy, but some of that violence and short-tempered was devoted to beating up Nazis and, in the 30s in Chicago. So, he had some, positive aspects. So his family got together, um, and and um, and they hired and fired lawyers like hot and cold running water. They just went through the most famous lawyers, right? Imagine you're a lawyer and you think you're hot stuff, and you have a chance to get the job of getting a guy acquitted who shot somebody in cold blood on live television. Imagine if you're a lawyer, what a great challenge that is. So every famous lawyer in America, was going to waive their fee whatever it was. And the Ruby family just hired and fired one after the other until Melvin Belli came along. And Belli at that point was one of the most famous lawyers in America. And people say he never tried a murder case. He actually had tried one murder case, but that was not his specialty. Also, he had the judge in the case had a longstanding grudge against Belli, which is not a good thing. Um, but he was the most famous lawyer in America, and he talked a good game. And since it was quite clear that Ruby had done it, the question was, what was his state of mind? And in those days, in the state of Texas, you could get somebody acquitted of like a crime of passion. It was unlikely that that would work with Ruby, so Belli came up with this experimental. He didn't just say he was insane, right? I mean, it was basically an insanity plea, but it was such a novel, untried, to pardon the pun, um, version of insanity called psychomotor epilepsy. I think Belli, what Belli first tried to do was have the case thrown out, and just on the grounds that there was no way Ruby could get a fair trial in Dallas because that's where it happened. And, sort of Dallas in the public consciousness was what the whole city was indicted in the both for the murder of Kennedy and the murder of Oswald, indicted in the public consciousness. So Belli tried every other thing he could, and tried to pick the jurors uh, who would give him a fair verdict, or an acquittal, or at least an insanity verdict. But ultimately, he couldn't. The judge would not declare mistrial, would not move the case, because for the judge it was a big deal too. Again, imagine you're the judge in the Jack Ruby case. Um, so Belli tried this thing called psychomotor epilepsy. Ruby had a history of mental illness. The thing about both him and Oswald, there's no doubt they were nuts. They both had long histories of erratic behavior and psychiatric treatment. The question is, were they lone nuts? That's of course the big thing that people want to know. So so I think ultimately Belli went with that defense, and he brought in, again, just like the most famous lawyers wanted to be involved, the most famous psychiatrists wanted to be involved. So until the Chicago 7 trial in 1970, this was probably the biggest circus trial, or one of maybe the Scopes monkey trial. But aside from that, this was the biggest circus trial in American history. Plus you had Jack Ruby, giving impromptu press conferences at every break at every recess. So I think it was a long shot. It was show offy on Belli's part. Probably his ego got the better of him, because the jury ended up convicting Ruby in like 2.5 hours. And I think they really convicted him in a much shorter time, but they thought just for the sake of appearances, they should wait at least a couple of hours. And it wasn't, it was actually a group of very, people say, oh, it was the Dallas jury. Dallas was a big city, and there were some very intelligent, sophisticated people on the on the jury, but they just Belli did not make his case.
As you were alluding to, Jack Ruby, born Jacob Rubenstein, comes across as a self-styled defender of Jews against anti-Semitism. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Well, Ruby grew up in the Maxwell Street ghetto of Chicago. That also produced in the same era Benny Goodman, William S. Paley, who founded CBS, Chief Justice Arthur Goldberg. It's sort of a classic kind of, Jewish ghetto assimilation, escape the ghetto story. And Ruby, his best friend growing up was a boxer named Barney Ross, who was actually studying to be a rabbi till his father was murdered in a holdup. It's kind of like the Batman story in a way. So Ruby, if you look at any video of Ruby or the video of Ruby shooting Oswald, the person he's reminiscent of, which kind of tripped me up for a while, was Jackie Gleason in The Honeymooners. He moves like a heavy set but graceful guy, which he was. He was a boxer, and I think from what I hear, a very good dancer too. And he would MC. He would be his own MC. He wanted to be a stand-up comic, and he had country western clubs besides the strip club. So, but he was very Jewish identified. He was very conscious of himself as Jewish. He was very sensitive to any anti-Semitism. He'd often come home at night, with like blood all over his clothes, and having been in a fight with some guy at a bar who made an anti-Semitic comment. And at the time leading up to the Kennedy assassination, there was the reason Kennedy came to Dallas was to shore up um, his support in the Democratic Party in Dallas for his reelection campaign in the following year in '64. This was late '63, and it was a big deal for the president to come to Dallas, even though it was a big city. I don't think it had a lot of visitors. Certainly presidents have been there in a long time. And so there was a leaflet that came out attacking Kennedy. A flyer that they get in the days before the internet. People would hand out leaflets, and it was signed by it was some committee that, the people, made up who were putting it out, but it was signed by a Bernard Weissman. And Ruby thought, it turns out correctly, that the extreme right wing people putting this out put a Jewish name on it so that if anything bad happened to Kennedy while he was there, it would be blamed on the Jews. I think, and it turned out that it was like really like four people with the whole organization. And one of them there was a Bernard Weissman, and they put his name on it kind of precisely, for that reason, which is really weird, but they did. Um, I think maybe to give themselves credibility. I don't think so much to foment anti-Semitism as to say, well, look, if this Jewish guy is anti-Kennedy, then you should be too. So Ruby was really concerned about that. Um, as I mean, and as Rabbi Silverman was, Silverman is on record as saying, when they arrested Oswald, thank God it wasn't somebody black, and thank God it wasn't somebody Jewish. I mean, that was, that was America then. That could never happen now. Um, but so and this was one of Ruby's obsessions. And he was he belonged to a up and coming upper middle class synagogue in Dallas, really, so he could network with the Jewish professionals there. And he did identify as Jewish, especially after his father died. His father died in 58, and he started going to Shul to say Kaddish regularly. But it's weird because Jack Ruby's Rolodex, if he had one, Jack Ruby's network of acquaintances and friends included like low life criminals, weird, fringe show business guys, and like dermatologists and rabbis. I mean, he had just like this, Jewish dermatologist, just this very strange group of people. Um, and I think he was a fairly unpleasant guy. It's one of those stories I kind of get found more to cringe about. I had thought of him as kind of Jackie Gleason in The Honeymooners. Maybe going a little more extreme than to the Moon Alice. I thought, yeah, but no, he was really like a low life, thug. But nonetheless, if you research about it, you know, so many people claimed that they were Jack Ruby's best friend, and it was like really a big thing of honor for them. That it was really interesting. Then they would say something horrible about him and something really like, vile that he'd done or that they heard about, but they wanted you to know that they were Jack Ruby. So he had some kind of charisma. He would hire and fire, his wait staff and the dancers at his strip, you know, like he would hire and fire them multiple times a week, the same people. And it's like, again, if it wasn't so weird and history changing and dire, it would kind of be almost a sitcom.
I'm curious about your impression of Michael Lerner's portrayal of Jack Ruby in Ruby and Oswald, the TV movie from 1978.
I thought Michael Lerner played it as a New York Jewish cliche. I like Michael Lerner, but I found that kind of a cringy kind of performance. Having said that, there are sometimes when I picture things that I talk about in the book that I read about, I do imagine the scene from that movie, because some of it was well written and well acted, but I thought his character was just too much of a cliche, especially the the Bronx accent. It would be like Ruby was so I mean, I'm sure there must have been a meeting, and they think, well, people will identify the New York accent more with somebody Jewish than the Chicago accent, so I think he's a wonderful actor, but he wasn't my. I didn't love that role.
It's weird because whenever I think of Jack Ruby, I just picture Michael Lerner.
I know. I hate to say it, but because there have been other movies about Ruby, JFK included, and the movie called Ruby, and they sort of they take off into especially the movie called Ruby. They take off into fantasy and speculation. No, I think JFK does too. You know who I thought was a terrific Ruby was in the Umbrella Academy, that season where they went to Dallas in 1963. I thought the guy who played Jack Ruby in that was terrific. If my book would have become a movie or a streaming series, I would want Seth Rogen to play Ruby.
If Ruby wasn't insane at the time of the shooting, he veered in that direction while behind bars. Among other things, he became convinced that millions of American Jews were being killed in a pogrom.
What do you make of this?
Well, I think Ruby was crazy, and I think he was in, you know, although it's not impossible that he might have been somehow trying to please somebody. Jack Ruby Jack Ruby had never killed anybody. He had beaten up a lot of people, but he had no history of being indicted or convicted of murder. So hey, he wasn't a professional hitman. So I think there was somewhere he became concerned about his family's well-being, and somewhere he got in his mind. I used to have a simple theory. I used to think that Ruby wanted to be the Jew that killed the guy that killed the president, and he thought he was doing public relations for the Jews. He thought, and for a while, and actually, it kind of worked temporarily. He was getting fan mail by the bagful, just hundreds of letters and telegrams. But a weird thing happened where when people realized, oh, now we'll never know what Oswald was going to say or who he might have implicated or just what his real reason if he did it, and in some weird way, the public view was that Ruby had killed Kennedy. It's this strange shift in. Now I don't even know. I don't think anybody said it out loud, but that was sort of the vibe, and that was the tone and tenor of the mail he got. So I think he was insane from the time he was a child. I think he sort of. I don't know if his clubs ever made any money. I mean, so either he was just being bled by the mob, which is possible, or maybe his family was just sort of keeping him afloat because they didn't want him sleeping on their couch. It's he. I don't think he ever made a profit. In his legitimate or his criminal activities. Um, but once he was in jail, what you're alluding to with the pogrom, it turned out his jail. He was in a cell that was near the psych ward of the prison. And so very often there were prisoners screaming at night, and Ruby interpreted that or claimed he interpreted as Jews being boiled in oil in the prison, and that his family was already dead and being tortured, and that he had started the second Holocaust in America. And there are people, but then a minute later he would be saying to his jailer, "Oh, who wants to play gin rummy?" I mean, so and then the rabbi would come to visit him, and he would hide under the table because he didn't want to be killed by the Nazis invading the. So there are those who think he was faking it, just trying to emphasize the insanity plea, but that he kept it up for so long. I mean, unless he was the world's greatest actor, then it does seem that that he was nuts before, and that having killed Oswald, in a way, it liberated him, right? I mean, there's a smile on his face, you see, and of course, the smile could be, "Haha, my plan worked," but the smile could also be, "My troubles are over." You know, all the people I owe money to, all the people I owe favors to, my nutty family, although the family, it turned out, got more and more enmeshed. Just I have no more responsibility. I'm now going to be in prison. And even if they let me out, then I'll be a celebrity. I mean, I think in some weird way, because he definitely, you know, and there's conflicting things. Because of course they claim that it was spontaneous, that he just snapped. But he also kind of said to his roommate, he had somebody crashing with him, um, and he kind of said to the guy, "I'm going to," not these are not the exact words, but he kind of said to the guy, "I'm going downtown to shoot Oswald," and yeah, and the roommate basically said, "Yeah, bring home a quart of milk when you're on your way back." I mean, it was just like Jack being crazy.
So, Danny, what's the verdict? Was Jack Ruby a hero, a villain, something in between? None of the above?
I think he was a villain. I think it's, I think it's funny. I think he was always a hero to his brother. I mean, that's sort of touching that Earl Ruby, who died, not that long ago, sort of kept the faith that his brother's motives were pure and that he just wanted to kind of express the rage the country felt about Kennedy's assassination. But look, he's just the fact that Ruby prevented us from ever, not that we necessarily would have known or that Oswald would have told the truth or whatever, or a full truth. But, Ruby made it impossible to ever get beyond, Oswald saying, I'm a patsy. I'm just a patsy, right? I mean, that, which, seems to have a specific meaning, but could have a variety of meanings, but will, I mean, one thing that blows my mind and I think, gives fuel to a lot of conspiracy theories, in 1963, you guys weren't even born, but in 1963, many middle-class families, including mine, had a tape recorder. I mean, my father was a cantor, so we had it, but I mean, it was not uncommon for people to have tape recorders. You know who didn't have a working tape recorder? The Dallas Police Department. That's who. Um, Even though they were in downtown Dallas, and unless they were strictly Shomer Shabbos, they could have gone and bought a tape recorder if the one in the station wasn't working. So that that's maybe in my research. I'm just grateful I didn't try to research Oswald, because that I think is an even more convoluted story. But that yeah. But we won't. So we won't know what he might have said in those closed door sessions. Nobody, as far as I know, took elaborate notes, and certainly no tape recording. And Ruby did try to get into one of those rooms, which adds yet another log to the conspiracy fire of Ruby trying to get in. But was he just going to try to kill him then? Was he? Who knows what? So yeah, I think a really interesting villain. And like any human, I came across many stories of Jack's incredible generosity, to people who worked for him, to people he barely knew. So the guy could be very generous and kind when he wasn't, on the other hand, you asked before about, would he black out or not know what he was doing? He went into fugue states. He would, he acted as his own bouncer. And if somebody, especially somebody made some kind of anti-Semitic crack, Jack would throw them down the stairs. He'd be pounding their head into the sidewalk. And then he would just go, what am I doing? He would just like snap out of it. And then he'd like literally give the guy here's a pizza. Don't sue me. Here's a pizza, which often worked. Apparently pizza in Dallas was hard to come by in those days. So yeah, I think a villain, but a very interesting one.
I'm wondering if Jack Ruby reminds you of any comic book supervillain.
In terms of his build, he reminds me of Ben Grimm, the Jack Kirby Thing. That sort of barrel-chested, burly, tough-talking guy. Maybe the Thing, when he was hypnotized by the Frightful Four into turning against the Fantastic Four in an early FF story by Lee Kirby and Coletta. Maybe that version of the Thing. That is a question I've never been asked. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Danny, for joining us.
My pleasure. And I hope I've been a somewhat amusing Jew anyway.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.